staring into space.
We're gonna head into the album called Enigma, which was released in January of 2013. I actually have notes saying January, so now I know. Thank you,
Well, it's funny because I've done a few interviews where they've said like, "Oh, that came out in 2012." I'm like, "Oh no, it didn't."
No.
No.
Let it be known now from this interview onward. But yeah, so very early 2013. Now that's a 2-year gap. You guys did the tour with Devin, then obviously, that happened. The buzz obviously you're in a buzz for a bit, then that kind of settles. What was the moment you decided you guys wanted to work on Enigma, and what was the process for that? Like,
Rich, as far as I remember, you were playing us demos of that record while we were on the tour bus.
Yeah, like some of those songs were written early, mid 2010, and then it was developed after the tour as well. But interestingly, I'd actually planned to have that album come out late in 2011. But there were all sorts of like personal issues, like family things and like label problems and this sort of stuff, where it just unfortunately didn't happen. And there just had to be a bit more of a gap. And it was it was a bit of a frustrating time in between those albums and that tour, because I had this music that I really wanted to get out there, but my hands were sort of a little bit tied.
Right.
And it was just sitting there for like probably over a year.
Like what was happening where you were not able to do that?
It was a label that was set up by my family. So then when I had family issues, that kind of brought the label in with it. So that's basically what caused that delay, yeah.
Okay. The moment you guys made Enigma, was there like a significant change regarding how you were going to approach this record? Was there something you wanted to do differently?
Yeah, this was like the first time the approach was different, because the first two albums, they were like separate standalone songs, written in kind of the same way at the same time, whereas Enigma, I don't think there was anything on that album that was written prior to the first album, like there was on The Face of the Unknown. The way I wanted to approach it was I wanted to do a concept album, because, you can't be a proper prog band unless you have a concept album.
It just, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. But also, like, the way that I like writing is sort of quite linear. So basically, the way Enigma was written and sort of the way it was planned out was basically start to finish. So I had a project in my DAW where I started at the beginning and I worked through until the end. So in a way, I kind of see it almost as one long song, even though there's obvious clear divisions and all that sort of thing. But in terms of the flow, the way I approached it was basically as one piece of music. There were ideas that obviously were standalone ideas that I had, like the parts that I played on the tour bus and these sorts of things. But then when I actually went back and started at the beginning, because I think it was, when was it? It would have been August 2010, I think, was when I really had the idea of like, this is going to be a concept album. Mm-hmm. So I started at the beginning and I basically just started writing, and the whole intro piece flowing into the next song was just one idea. And then it just so happened that these other sort of standalone songs that I had fitted in like tempo-wise and flow-wise with the album, that I could then just like, when I got to that point, I'm like, well, actually, the thing that I had here fits in there, which of course happened over a period of time. So then it was things that I played to the guys on the tour. Like when I got home, I was like, okay, so that bit can go where I'm up to now. And it was basically written like that, just completely linear from start to finish.
That is really cool. And Andy, what was your, like, what was it for you to work on that record?
Production-wise, it was kind of business as usual. I had a limited role on that record, which was basically one of many featured vocalists, but there was a little bit of a change insofar as that, as Rich says, it was one long continuous piece of music, so I had pieces here and there that I did, rather than doing track number 2 and track number 8. I did, 25% of the album spread out over the entire album, which was a cool experience. However, because there were little snippets, Rich actually only just sent me little snippets. So when I had a 45-second bit, I maybe had a minute of the song, and I didn't know the rest of the song. So it wasn't until the album was done I actually figured out how all these pieces fit together, and what went before what and what went after what, and it was a great thing to actually hear it.
So I was just going to say, the reason for that, why you got like little snippets, was because you were the first guy to record any vocals for it. So then otherwise there would just be like huge gaps where you're like, okay, so I guess I'm like waiting 20 minutes until my next bit of vocal.
Yeah, exactly.
But for me, this is like the start of the second phase of like Aeon Zen, and you can hear it in the sound. Rich had obviously, gotten really familiar with the 7-string since then. You hear the first kind of modern djenty influences from there, and the songwriting kind of starts to take shape in what we would hear in Ephemera and in Veritas after that. So for me, there's a pretty clear divider between the first 2 albums and then the next 3 albums.
Regarding Enigma, did you guys played a few live shows for that, I believe, right? Around that time as well? How many was that, and how big did you guys approach that?
I think it was a handful of shows. Like there wasn't a big tour for this album. We had like some festivals, a couple of standalone shows, where we actually played the album in full, start to finish, as well as like the hits, if you can call them.
And Andy, for you, that was, once again, you were basically trying to crawl inside the skins of the other singers to make sure that you did the whole album, right?
That's right. I've really honed my skills as an impersonator in these 10 years or something, yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I've heard many people say that impersonation is a really good way of also expanding your own palette. So, it's... Absolutely.
But yeah, like approaching those vocals, I think it's one thing playing live when you have these standalone songs, like one sung by a different singer. Like, that's one thing where you're like, okay, so I have to get in the space of this guy for this song, or sort of try and not mimic, but recreate what they did. Then when you have one song that's maybe like 5, 6, 7 minutes long, and you have to recreate like 4 or 5 singers within that space, like that's a completely different ballgame.
In that sense, I can imagine that is also like an acting job in a way.
That's exactly how I approached it. It was basically like delivering a dialogue as the same person. It's like trying to be this guy and then be this guy, and then
It still worked, and I think people still reacted to it the same way that they had when it was standalone songs. So I think, in terms of the execution, I think we still managed to pull it off convincingly. Or Andy did, because he was doing the bulk of the work in that regard.
You were just standing there like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah. I'm just like, doom, 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 doom. Like,
We're heading into an EP called Self-Portrait that was released in November of 2013. What is the situation with that?
It was kind of more of a stopgap, a bit of a filler, but I didn't want it to, obviously not to sound like a filler, but it was just to basically bridge the time between that album and the follow-up. Because, of course, between The Face of the Unknown and then Enigma that came a few years later, we had maybe more shows and the tour and all that sort of thing. Whereas this time, it was sort of a show here and there, some festivals. So it was kind of like, well, I still want to keep this going and not lose the momentum when you don't have shows to promote. So it's like, well, what can we do that isn't like a big album, but will still be something interesting and creative that will fill that gap? Not that I don't like the sound of A Mind's Portrait, but I think at that point where we were had kind of progressed, where I thought it would be interesting to reinterpret those songs maybe from where we were at that point. And also with the live band setup that we had, with Andy doing the vocals and I'm sort of filling in bits, maybe a few bits of lead vocals and some backing vocals here and there, and seeing what those songs would sound like from the modern, like where we were at that point.
Andy, what was that like for you? Was it fun to redo those songs and actually put your stamp on it a bit more, perhaps?
Yeah, great chance to revisit some old material. And as I said, with Enigma kind of marking phase 2 of the Aeon Zen sound, it made a lot of sense to bring some of the material from the phase 1 sound and see, well, what does that sound like in the new soundscape? That was really cool, and a lot of really good like reimaginings came from that, and that's some of the material that I like the most of what we've done.
You also mentioned the guitar switch, so to speak, like the fact that everything got a bit heavier. Was that something that was very audible in this release as well? Like, did you down-tune a bunch of songs, or how did that work out?
100%. Absolutely.
Yeah, like Time Divine off A Mind's Portrait, that was originally on like a standard tuned 7-string. This one was like, I think it was down a minor third or something, so it just had that like heavier, sort of chunky, djenty, if you want, kind of thing to it.
Suddenly there was hair on it, basically. That's what it was.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I don't remember if the whole EP was in that tuning, but it might well have been.
We're heading into the next big release, because you said Self-Portrait was a bit of a, I would say a proper appetizer, an amuse. But the main course was Ephemera, which was released in 2014. If you're looking at that record in that respect, because you said Self-Portrait was, well, basically older songs reimagined, and you were already working on Ephemera around that time, I take it. What was it like to work on Ephemera, Rich? What spawned that?
Well, the idea I had, and the reason for making the Self-Portrait EP standalone, is that I really wanted to finish the story of Enigma, or continue it, because if you listen to Enigma, I mean, you'd think that there's a conclusion there, because it's basically, it ends with the entire world being destroyed. But what I wanted to do was, like, find a way to continue that story and then bring it to a different conclusion. So that was where the idea for Ephemera started, and hence why it's kind of a similar kind of structure to Enigma, in that it's the same sort of concept album, start to finish kind of thing, everything flows together. So that was basically the genesis of that album.
World-ending stories are always very uplifting and very good for morale, and we all know that. What was the difference then in comparison to, was it like, okay, I'm gonna do the same starting point where we're gonna go for a parallel universe kind of thing, or how did that work?
From what I remember, it was something like that. Like it was a lot more maybe sci-fi, kind of more abstract in a way. But I think that kind of reflects the sound of the album, because it has a more sort of metallic sound, like a sort of hollow, futuristic kind of sound to it, where it's got more industrial elements and all that sort of thing to it. And the introduction of like 8-string guitars that then sort of push another dimension a bit further. And then, of course, the biggest difference was that there weren't guest singers on this album. It was basically down to Andi with me filling in the gaps again, as we were doing live and as we'd done on the EP. So I think it was also a case that the Self-Portrait EP kind of introduced that idea to people, and then on this album we really took it another step further and really showed showed people what we can do in that format as well.
I'm looking at Andi in this case. Were there conversations about this in advance, or was this something that naturally grew? Or
it was just something that grew out organically, because we had already by that time become more cohesive as a band, and we were talking, we were practicing, we were playing live shows, and it really kind of like, after a while, it didn't really make sense to leave 75% of the singing to other people and have me do 25% when I was, really kind of part of the band now, in a way. Yeah. And we were way past, guest performer or anything like that. So it was really cool for me to be able to just attack an entire record's worth of material and be able to do not just kind of the stereotypical Andi Kravljaca voice for what I needed, but I could do the calm one and the aggressive one and the fast one and the slow one, and kind of show different aspects of my voice, which is one of the reasons I got into prog metal to start with, because prog as material is so diverse and you get to sing so many different kinds of music, and this is really the first Aeon Zen record where I got a chance to do that, so I really appreciated that. Still to this day, my favorite album of the ones we've done.
All right, yeah, and it's also like you kind of signified like you had a part 1 of Aeon Zen and a part 2, right? And would this be the start of part 3 if there is a part 3 in this case, or is this more of a continuation of that part 2 you just mentioned?
No, I'd say that phase 2 started with Enigma and probably ended with In Veritas for me, because that's a pretty the sound wise, those albums, you can listen to them and you definitely hear it's the same band.
And I was just going to add, in terms of like Andi handling all the vocals on this one, like we felt like more of a band. And I think because the entire reason that I started getting guest vocalists in the first place, like I said at the beginning, was because I couldn't find people local to me to be in a band. So then, of course, I didn't know what was going to happen at that point. I didn't know Andi was then going to continue on and play live and be so enthusiastic about the project as he was. And then the fact that he was then sort of led us to this point where now we are a band, and I'm comfortable like relinquishing that duty onto him, because I know that he's going to do an amazing job, and because we played live, like we get to know each other and that sort of thing. And it's not just like contacting random people and like, hey, I like your voice, can you sing on this?
Yeah, exactly, like,
exactly. At this point, I actually know what Andi can do. Not that he doesn't still surpass it, but like at that point, like I know that he's gonna make this amazing no matter what.
Right. And you have mixed presets for my voice, so that just makes it easy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, oh, okay, yeah, just the Andy EQ for the whole album.
Yeah, it works. Okay, good. We're good. We're golden. No, but I can get it though. It's like when you start out in a project-based situation, it's a different kind of writing. And at a certain point, when you're a band and when you know each other's strengths and or weaknesses, like you might not even write on that on purpose, but I can imagine that subconsciously you might also make choices like, oh yeah, this will work really well if Andy does it like this, or Andy, in your case, it's like, oh, I hear this part that Rich did and I could totally do this now because that would,
Yeah, because we know each other, and like I know maybe what Andy would like to sing over, and then of course you know maybe what I would like to hear over the top of it.
Right.
By that point, because you've got familiar enough with the type of vocals that I write that it just sort of works itself out pretty naturally.